If you're part of today's woke revolution, you need to study the part of revolutions where they spin out of control because the revolutionaries get so drunk on their own purifying elixir, they imagine they can reinvent the very nature of human beings. Communists thought selfishness could be cast out of human nature. Russian revolutionaries spoke of the new Soviet man who wasn't motivated by self-interest, but instead wanted to be part of a collective. No, it turns out he wanted to be on a yacht in a Gucci tracksuit holding a vodka and a prostitute. Not standing in line all day for a potato. The problem with communism, and with some very recent ideologies here at home, is that they think you can change reality by screaming at it, that you can bend human nature by holding your breath. But that's the difference between reality and your mommy. Lincoln once said that you can repeal all past history, but you still cannot repeal human nature. But he's canceled now, so fuck him.
If you're a lefty, you will have undoubtedly come into contact with some form of the argument you just heard from Bill Maher. In short, it's the argument that free market capitalism is the system that is most compatible with human nature because it is in our nature to be self-interested, greedy profit maximizers. Thus, socialism or communism is nothing but an unnatural affront to this immutable fact. I must admit, when I was first confronted by this argument back in my high school days, I was at a loss. I mean, after all, it does seem intuitively true that the people around us act in self-interested, profit-maximizing ways. People are always out and about, hustling, buying and selling, trying to make money for themselves. And it sure does seem like a system of private enterprise in a free and open market harnesses this apparent natural disposition of ours. Looking back at history unfortunately appears to confirm this. Weren't there countless civilizations and societies that utilized markets, traded goods and services for profit, with a seemingly endless supply of greedy characters accumulating private wealth? Surely that is proof of our innate capitalist disposition, right? Well, it wasn't until my college days that I finally came across a satisfactory answer to this conundrum. In this video, I will attempt to explain how the human nature pro-capitalism argument is based on a very powerful and pervasive myth, and why its widespread, unchallenged propagation is extremely dangerous. While the idea of ascribing rational self-interest to human nature has been discussed in philosophy for some time, its explicit relation to economic systems, and use as a justification for a free market system in particular, can be found in the works of none other than Adam Smith. Writing on the eve of the emergence of modern capitalism, Smith famously asserted that the propensity to truck, barter, and exchange one thing for another is common to all men and to be found in no other race of animals. This idea was eagerly adopted and expanded upon by philosophers like Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, who essentially took for granted the selfish, economizing nature of man. They used this to argue in favor of laissez-faire economics and free trade, in short, classical liberalism. The idea was that a free market system creates private incentives to produce outcomes in line with the public good. Through the unfettered forces of supply and demand, greedy individuals will be incentivized to produce all the goods and services that society needs, whilst the invisible hand of the market works to distribute them appropriately. Indeed, thanks in part to their efforts, classical liberalism became the dominant state ideology of Britain. It is no surprise then that with the global expansion of this ideology and in tandem free market capitalism, this conception of human nature began to be taken for granted. When we look at the extremely sharp rise of technological progress, wealth, and standard of living afforded through the global conquest of liberal capitalism, the idea has only become more cemented. Looking around the modern world, it would seem to be self-evident that this interpretation of human nature and its relation to our political and economic systems is simply fact. We are not Homo sapiens, we are Homo economicus. This truth of human nature has become so deeply ingrained that its anachronistic application to all of human history has also become the dominant lens through which we understand human societies of the past. All humans of the past were already capitalists. They simply didn't yet live under an economic system that took full advantage of it.
We are here to help the Vietnamese because inside every there is an American trying to get out.
In order to tell this part of the story, we must move away from the shores of Britain and head towards the banks of the river Danube. One of the first and most influential works of political economy to counter the assumption of Homo economicus was written by the Austro-Hungarian social scientist Karl Polanyi. The Great Transformation, written in 1944, is in my opinion one of the most eye-opening works in the field of economic anthropology and economic history. I highly recommend giving it a read. In response to Smith's famous line asserting that man has an innate propensity to truck, barter, and trade, Polanyi wrote the following. In retrospect, it can hardly be said that no misreading of the past ever proved more prophetic of the future. For while up to Adam Smith's time that propensity had hardly shown up on a considerable scale in the life of any observed community, and had remained, at best, a subordinate feature of economic life, 100 years later an industrial system was in full swing over the major part of the planet, which, practically and theoretically, implied that the human race was swayed in all its economic activities, if not also its political, intellectual, and spiritual pursuits by that one particular propensity. Curious how such a fundamental component of human nature only seemed to arise in our species in the last 200 years. He goes on. While history and ethnography know of various kinds of economies, most of them comprising the institution of markets, they know of no economy prior to our own, even approximately controlled and regulated by markets. This will become abundantly clear from a bird's-eye view of the history of economic systems and of markets presented separately. The role played by markets in the internal economy of the various countries, it will appear, was insignificant up to recent times, and the changeover to an economy dominated by the market pattern will stand out all the more clearly. In order to demonstrate his point, Polanyi goes on to claim that all economic systems prior to capitalism could be characterized by the principles of reciprocity and redistribution, not self-interested gain, and that these systems were organized by institutional patterns along the lines of symmetry and centricity, not markets. His chief example to illustrate his point is through the examination of the Kula ring exchange of the Trobriand Islands located just east of Papua New Guinea. The Melanesian inhabitants of these islands developed an intricate trade network in which no profit was involved, no money or currency, and no haggling. Prestigious, culturally valuable necklaces and armbands were traded between a series of islands under a system regulated entirely by social etiquette. This trade was conducted under a complex system of reciprocal give and take within a set of social institutions that established symmetry between the trading partners. This type of economy is sometimes broadly referred to as a gift economy, of which there are many more examples in human history and even in modern times. Polanyi goes on to show that his characterization of pre-capitalist economic systems also applies to the larger, more vast civilizations of the past. The Babylonian city-states as well as the Egyptian civilization had highly centralized social institutions, usually with some sort of divine ruler at the top, which dictated production and distributed wealth and goods along the principle of redistribution. In the really early days, this was done physically, where harvests and tools were stored in the temple at the center of the city and consequently redistributed by the ruler. Later, such as in Egypt, this was achieved through the medium of currency and taxation under a highly bureaucratic state organization. Later still, the feudal system that became dominant in Europe also functioned along these lines, where production was organized for a series of lieges who consequently redistributed goods and privileges down a chain of vassals. Polanyi goes on to outline one more pre-capitalist economic principle, householding, which functions in much the same way as the others, only within smaller, usually family units, producing and distributing goods for their own insular consumption. Here, think of the manorial Roman familia, the democratic South Slavic zadruga, or even the patriarchal homesteading of the American West. The key takeaway of Polanyi's history of economic systems is that economic activity was always subordinate to social institutions, whether it's gift-giving social etiquette, the pharaoh's production quotas, or the dictates of the head of the household. Succinctly put, man's economy as a rule is submerged in his social relationships. He does not act so as to safeguard his individual interests in the possession of material goods. He acts so as to safeguard his social standing, his social claims, his social assets. He values material goods only insofar as they serve this end. In other words, the economic sphere was subordinate to the social sphere. But what about markets, you might ask? I mean, we know they've been around since ancient times. Well, for one, Polanyi points out that markets were not nearly as ubiquitous in the past as they are made out to be. Furthermore, the markets of pre-capitalist societies would be largely unrecognizable with how we use the term today. A more apt term for what we would find in the past is a marketplace. These were physical locations where goods were exchanged and distributed, but almost always in a tightly constrained fashion. Rituals and ceremonies largely controlled the marketplace's functioning, and the lack of competition meant that engaging in truck and barter was an infrequent occurrence. Once again, we can see that social institutions and social incentives dominated. Given this understanding of economic history, a far better case can be made for the natural default state of human nature to be one of an extreme malleability to social institutions, which in turn organize economic activity. So rather than Homo economicus, it is much more fair to say that we are Homo socialis. This perception of human nature, that our behaviors and motivations are extremely open to socialization, even makes sense in the framework of our current system. The propensity we see for man to truck, barter, and trade all around us today is a product of the fact that we have recently undergone a radical departure from the organization of all past human societies. We have relinquished social control over the economy in favor of a cold, mechanical, self-regulating market. People act self-interested and in a profit-maximizing manner, not because it is innate to do so, but because they are incentivized to do so by the market institutions that have come to govern our society. They do it because they are socialized to behave this way. This is what led Polanyi to assert that a market economy can only function in a market society, meaning a society in which its members have been socialized to act in accordance with market principles. Indeed, when liberal capitalist institutions first began to be adopted, there was massive turmoil and significant resistance to them from the social sphere. This was because a market society had not yet been truly established. In Europe, this resistance took many forms, most prominently by the nobility and aristocratic classes fighting to cling to their ancient feudal privileges, but also by the peasantry, which had been thrusted into the role of an urban industrial workforce. Outside of Europe, market institutions had to be exogenally thrusted upon societies by force, most prominently through the imperialism of the British Empire. A prime example of this is what took place in India throughout the 19th century. In India, the British forcefully dismantled the local social institutions that dictated the production and redistribution of goods and applied their own free market institutions with the belief that greater economic growth and efficiency would be achieved. This resulted in a massive dislocation of even the most basic supply chains, such as for agriculture. Consequently, tens of millions of Indians died during the famines of the 1870s and 1890s. Historian and political scientist Mike Davis even dubbed these events as late Victorian Holocausts. He writes, "Millions died not outside the modern world system, but in the very process of being forcibly incorporated into its economic and political structures. They died in the golden age of liberal capitalism. Indeed, many were murdered by the theological application of the sacred principles of Smith, Bentham, and Mill." Apart from the obvious tragedies in terms of the loss of human life and the misery and suffering accompanied with this great transformation, you might be wondering, hey, these things happen anytime a new system is instituted. Sure, things start out rough, but people have adapted now, and the global capitalist order does seem to be more or less functioning rather efficiently. No one would deny that capitalism has far exceeded the economic systems that came before it, especially in terms of technological progress and the production of material wealth. Even Marx praised capitalism in this sense. But we must recognize that capitalism also has major fundamental problems, everything from the cyclical instability of markets, natural tendency towards monopoly, failure of distribution for basic life-sustaining goods, extreme wealth inequality and poverty, the accumulation of wealth and property, inordinate and unchecked power concentrated in the hands of the wealthy, extreme labor exploitation, ecological destruction, and so on. By understanding that human behavior and motivation is highly malleable to the institutions we arbitrarily choose to construct, we can move forward with full confidence that it is indeed possible to replace capitalism with something better. This is why the myth that Homo economicus is human nature is employed so readily by the bourgeoisie. It is a way to convince the masses that the status quo, the current system which has conveniently led to them being wealthy and powerful, is the pinnacle of human social and economic organization, that any deviation from what we have now would go against our very nature, would be bound to fail and ultimately leave us worse off. They simply want to hide the fact that we can build a better world.